Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be talking about how a short walk to meet up with a friend turned into a search for a missing girl, the discovery of her body, and the hunt to find her killer. Today's case is about the murder of Kimberly Simon. Kimberly Simon, who pretty much always went by Kim, was in her junior year at Whitesboro High School in New York. At 16 years old, she had a love for school, which she excelled at. Her friends described her as one of those students that could pass all her tests without having to study. But outside of school, her true passion lied in the arts. She would spend hours and hours listening to music and watching movies. At the time of our story, Kim had a boyfriend named Rick, who was head over heels for her. So much so that he had dreams of marrying her after high school. On the afternoon of September 18th, 1985, Kim left school with plans to meet up with her best friend, Linda Fiorini, later on that night. The two said they'd meet up at the Whitesboro Middle School a few hours later, with intentions of walking over to Rick's house to surprise him, but he wouldn't be out of work until around 6 p.m. Rick had been working as a carpenter, and between Kim's school schedule and his work schedule, the two didn't get much time to see each other.
Yeah, I'm all set with being the third wheel there.
Well, I think it's pretty cool of Kim. Think about all the stories you hear where a friendship is lost because of an infatuation with a new love interest. Heck, even I'm guilty of it. So I think it was nice that she wanted to still hang out with Linda, even if it was just a walk to Rick's. But back to the story. The time comes when Kim should be meeting up with Linda at the middle school. After about a half an hour, when Kim still hasn't shown up, Linda decides to head home to try and figure out what's going on. During this time, around 6 p.m., Rick calls Kim's house on a whim and asks to talk to her. He ends up speaking with her dad, who unknowingly ruins the surprise that Kim's on her way over to his house. Great job, Dad, you blew it. Regardless of the ruined surprise, Rick is pumped he's going to see Kim, so he freshens up and gets ready to greet her when she arrives. Now's around the time when Linda gets home. She'd probably been racking her brain as to why Kim never got to the middle school. She had just made the plans and now she bails? Did she get lost along the way or distracted? Something must have come up and she just wasn't able to get in touch. Well, Linda gets inside and immediately calls Kim's house. She gets a hold of Kim's dad and tells him that his daughter never made it to the middle school as they'd planned. At this point, word starts to spread like wildfire among Kim's friends and family that she'd gone missing. Rick and multiple other friends head to the Simon home to begin searching the area. They'd go on to search for hours, and before they knew it, it was the next morning. 12 hours later, and Kim is still nowhere to be seen. On September 19th at approximately 11:24 a.m., police received word that someone had located a dead body on Mohawk Street, roughly 2 miles from Kim's house. Investigators would respond to the area and find a young girl left partially clothed, later identified as Kim Simon, with injuries indicating she may have been beaten to death. This location would later be described as a secluded area near a gravel pit. While searching the area, authorities would also locate some of her belongings, one item being a shoe, found down the street near Route 5A about a mile away. The other item found was located on Clinton Street near the Carolyn Court Apartments, less than a mile from her body. As the investigation progressed, Kim's body would be taken in for an autopsy, and it was determined that she'd been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. This news would kickstart the search for those responsible for the rape and murder of Kim Simon, and police would immediately begin canvassing the area while interviewing potential eye and ear witnesses.
Ear witness?
Yeah. It's a real term police use when describing a witness that heard something rather than saw something.
Well, I guess that makes sense then.
So the whole reason I bring up ear witnesses is because as police are interviewing people in the area, they receive several tips. Some people recall seeing a female matching Kim's description in the area around Mohawk Street at the time of her disappearance, while others explain how they heard a woman's screams later that night at a location known as the Water Tower, which was nearby to the area Kim was last known to be in. Knowing that there were people coming forward with information, let's go back a bit and review what was going on during the time Kim went missing. So, we know that she left her house sometime before 6 p.m. to meet up with Linda at the middle school, which can be cross-referenced against Rick's phone call to her house. The distance between the two locations is roughly 3 miles. This in-between time, while Linda is waiting for Kim to show up, is where the focus of the investigation is aimed. Now, with this being an older case, there are holes in the timeline, but this is where those witnesses come into play. Like I said, several people came forward stating that they saw someone matching Kim's description on Mohawk Street, around the time she would have been walking to the middle school. According to the Remember Kim Simon website, it stated that she was seen talking to a, quote, husky blonde-haired man driving a red truck, end quote. When hearing this, we can think of a couple different scenarios. One being that this was just a friendly conversation with whoever this guy was, or this husky fella offered Kim a ride the rest of the way to the middle school and went on to abduct her.
How far is Mohawk Street from the middle school?
About a mile or 1.5 kilometers for our listeners who aren't in the States.
And how far was the middle school from Kim's house?
Roughly 3 miles or almost 5 kilometers.
So she'd already walked 2/3 of the way there. I'd have to imagine that this person approached her, and if she did get into the truck, then the unsub...
Yes.
Thought you'd like that. So if she did get into the truck, then I think this person must have convinced her to. She clearly didn't have a problem with walking the distance. Her and Linda would have still had to walk to Rick's house after meeting up anyway.
I kind of agree with you, but I also think about how a 1-mile walk could take her like 15 to 20 minutes, when if she got a ride, it'd be like 2 minutes. So maybe she took this guy up on the offer to get to Linda faster? I know it was 1985 and times were different, but when I think about myself, call me lazy, but I don't want to have to walk more than a few streets over, never mind 3 miles to meet a friend.
True. I guess if the guy came off nice to her or was maybe even known to her in passing, like someone she'd seen around, then she wouldn't need much convincing to hop in for a quick 2-minute ride. Either way, she's seen talking to this guy on Mohawk Street, the same street her body was later found on. What about those ear witnesses you were talking about? Did what they hear match up with what these people saw?
It sure did, but they weren't around the same time. Those ear witnesses that heard the screams near the water tower didn't hear them until hours later. But it's located right behind Harts Hill Elementary School in Marcy, New York. This school is right on Mohawk Street. It's just a little ways down the road.
Okay, well, knowing that these two things could be linked, police need to find this guy and start questioning him ASAP. I know that just because the two were seen together doesn't mean that he's guilty, but he very well may know something.
My thoughts exactly. Aside from the witnesses in the Mohawk Street area, other people would come forward stating that they'd seen Kim out and about later on that same night. When speaking with investigators, these other witnesses mentioned that she was at a place known as the Three Bears, attending some sort of party. The exact time of this sighting is a bit fuzzy, but it's believed to have occurred between 10 p.m. and midnight.
So she made plans to meet up with Linda, then to go see Rick, but doesn't do either of these, and then she's seen at some party? This doesn't sound right.
Oh, I'm right there with you. There are several interesting things about this claim which made me question the whole scenario. So my first instinct was the same as you. She had these other plans. Why should we believe that she'd just ditch her best friend and boyfriend to go to some party? But then, get this. Apparently this party she was supposedly seen at, it's known as some sort of satanic gathering. It wasn't clear if it was some type of ritual or whatever, but it's believed that those in attendance held interests in Satanism and death and all that jazz. So I'm like, Kim wasn't into that kind of stuff, so why would she be there in the first place?
Well, you'd have to ask how she got there and if she was there willingly.
That's precisely where my mind went. Like, did someone befriend her and convince her to go? As some type of ritual like, oh, let's pick her and convince her to come with us and then do all this weird devil worship stuff to her? Or, more along the lines of what I believe, did she get dragged there unwillingly?
I'm interested to know if that husky feller had anything to do with the stuff going down at Three Bears or, later on that night, the water tower.
Well, as we continue to find out more info throughout the investigation, some of these questions are answered. It's believed that Kim had most likely been taken there against her will. Some of the people that claimed to have seen her there stated it looked like she may have been drugged. To further this idea, Kim's best friend Linda also stated that this was not something Kim would ever do, and it's certainly not a place she would visit. This brings us back to the truck guy, and your idea of him having something to do with getting Kim to Three Bears, and then later that night, the water tower. If she never made it to the middle school, or Rick's, but she's seen talking to this guy, and people heard a woman's screams in that same general area later on that night, I mean, come on, need I say more?
Yeah, even if the whole Three Bears thing was BS and she wasn't there, this guy in the truck has to have ties to her disappearance at a minimum.
So, to continue on along that same vein, the people who heard the screams behind the place we've been referring to as the water tower heard them around 1 o'clock in the morning. So this wasn't shortly after the time she was seen talking to the pickup truck guy. This was hours later. So if these screams were in fact Kim's, then you could assume that she had somehow ended up behind the elementary school near the water tower, and this is where she was raped and killed, with the murderer dumping her body a short way down that same road, probably on their way out of the area. This idea would be solidified when a forensic pathologist was later interviewed, mentioning that they did not believe that the location where Kim's body was found was the same place she was killed. And to note, the distance between the water tower and where she was found is barely a couple-minute drive. So at this point, investigators are starting to piece together the timeline of events taking place that night and work to figure out who she was last seen with. They go on to interview several people, but most notably a 19-year-old boy named Stephen Barnes. 3 days after Kim was found murdered, authorities brought him in for questioning. It's reported that he was interrogated for 12 straight hours. He was asked the obvious questions of where he was and who he was with at the time of her death, and was even administered a polygraph, which came back inconclusive. You've got to think that with all this time and energy invested into this interrogation, that police believe Stephen may be their guy. But even after all of this, Stephen provides authorities with a solid alibi, stating he was at a bowling alley with friends for pretty much the entire night that Kim was missing. So, after an exhaustive interrogation, authorities let him go and continue on with their search for Kim's killer. 2 years would go by before there was any further movement in the case. But this is when police would circle back to Stephen Barnes and ask him to provide samples of his hair, blood, and saliva. Okay, so does this mean police are onto something?
I would assume that if they let him go 2 years ago while he was a person of interest, police must have uncovered something new and probably substantial that they think they can tie to Barnes.
Well, just a short time after investigators received those samples, in March of 1988, police go on to arrest Stephen Barnes for the rape and murder of Kimberly Simon. The following year, on May 15, 1989, Stephen Barnes' trial would begin. Now, at the age of 22, he continued to maintain his innocence, as he had from the very beginning. Throughout the trial, the defense would bring forward witnesses that corroborate Stephen's alibi of being at the bowling alley. Once his alibi had been laid out for the jury, Stephen's brother-in-law testifies that on the night of Kim's murder, he saw a woman on Mohawk Street that looked just like Kim Simon, getting into a pickup truck that was very clearly not Stephen's truck.
I'm not saying I don't believe him, but I don't believe him.
I mean, I'm not saying I disagree. He's definitely not the most ideal witness, but a witness nonetheless.
True, but what are the odds of this relative being on Mohawk Street at the exact time of this going on, seeing someone who looks just like the victim getting into a pickup truck that's not your brother-in-law's, and remembering this chance observation well enough to testify to it in court?
Yeah, I'm fully on board with what you're saying with this one. Doesn't mean he's lying, but it is a little weird. Well, the prosecution thought similarly and went on to bring forward their own eyewitnesses. Those who testified stated that they not only saw Kim on Mohawk Street, but that they saw her get into that truck with the driver, who they identified as Stephen Barnes. These claims were actually what led police to question Barnes in the first place. So it seems like the defense and prosecution are just going tit for tat right now, bringing forward people with contrarian stories. How could a jury really confirm who's telling the truth and who isn't? who's remembering things correctly and whose mind may be misremembering, or just straight up lying. I feel like you kind of have to take both sides with a grain of salt, and then take things like physical evidence and other testimony brought forward to formulate your decision from there.
Yeah, I think if these eyewitnesses on both sides appear credible, then you've got to use them to rule each other out, and like you said, use everything else to come to a conclusion.
With that being said, the prosecution went on to bring forward plenty of scientific evidence proving Barnes's guilt.
Oh, that doesn't sound sarcastic at all.
Yeah, I have some strong opinions on this stuff, but I'll get into that later. On June 2nd, 1989, the jury would go on to convict Stephen Barnes of first-degree rape, first-degree sodomy, and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. One might believe that justice had been served, and that Kim's family and friends now had some sort of closure, knowing that the person responsible had been captured. And I'm sure that was the case for many years. But almost 2 decades later, Stephen Barnes would walk out of prison a free man after being exonerated of his crimes.
Oh geez, what happened?
Good old DNA evidence.
Ah, okay. I mean, if he's truly not guilty, it sucks that he was put away for all these years. But I'm glad it's something like this that exonerates him, instead of hearing that, someone had planted evidence on him back in the day or something like that.
I agree, and thanks to advancements nowadays, many wrongdoings that were unfortunately just a product of their time are being undone, as much as they can be at least. So we know Stephen is exonerated based on DNA evidence and advancements in technology and testing that didn't exist in 1989. In the Innocence Project's write-up on Stephen's case and subsequent exoneration, it states that his conviction was based on, quote, questionable eyewitness identifications and 3 types of unvalidated forensic science, end quote. I gotta say, I'm fully on their side when they use the term unvalidated regarding the forensic evidence. So I'll give you a rundown of each one, and you can come to your own conclusion on if you believe he should have been convicted based on the evidence provided. Okay, so one of the first pieces of evidence that's noted is a comparison test of hair taken from Stephen's truck and Kim's body. Forensics determined that hairs found in Stephen's truck were more similar to Kim's and not similar to Stephen's.
That sounds really, exact.
Right? But okay, I guess I can see where the prosecution would be going, saying that this hair is like Kim's and not like Steve's, so let's put it out there and try to get the jury to believe Kim must have been in the car. We can couple this hair evidence with our eyewitness testimony and try to paint that picture.
I guess if this hair evidence is a real thing, then I can kind of understand the link that they're trying to make.
Well, personally, I don't believe that this evidence is credible. You see, there's a lot of controversy surrounding hair evidence in general. Things were obviously different back in 1989, but I did a little bit of research and found some contradictory information. Based on an article titled Forensic Hair Comparison, Background Information for Interpretation on the FBI's website, written in 2009, there's a passage that stands out regarding the reliability of hair examination. It states, quote, although the science of microscopic hair examination can never result in an identification, that is, conclude that a hair came from one individual to the exclusion of all others, the vast amount of both macroscopic and microscopic information available from hair analysis can provide a strong basis for an association and certainly provides strong exculpatory evidence, end quote.
Okay, well, that just sounds like it should be used to rule things out, not to prove something.
Exactly. And then I found another article from UPI titled Study, Hair Analysis as an Unreliable, Flawed Forensic Technique. The information for this article comes from a researcher named Jim Norton. Within the article, it describes the miscarriage of justice that has taken place due to the supposedly unreliable science that is hair analysis. It states, quote, since 1989, 74 people have been sentenced to hard time for serious crimes as a result of hair analysis, only to later be exonerated by DNA analysis. Forensic scientists use up to 20 different characteristics to identify one hair from another, but Norton and his colleagues say many of these characteristics are subjective. Give a hair to 5 forensic scientists, they say, and you might get 5 different descriptions. Making matters worse, unlike fingerprint and DNA analysis, scientists are without population-based databases with which to compare hair samples with. Therefore, they're unable to properly estimate the probability of a hair having a specific hair characteristic, end quote. So, based on that last quote, it seems as though hair analysis is a rather subjective science and not the type that'd be without flaws. Based on what I've read, it appears, at least to me, as though this is a personal opinion-based analysis. One scientist may look at a strand of hair and determine it's more similar to that of mine rather than John's, but then another scientist might look at it and think the complete opposite. However, we have to remember that back in '89, there weren't any other types of testing to utilize. Hair evidence was much more widely used and accepted back then than it is today. So I can see from a jury's perspective why this may have swayed them towards a conviction, as DNA wasn't a thing for them to even consider in '89. Hindsight's always 20/20, but imagine what the jurors who convicted him feel like today after hearing that they essentially sent him to prison based on pseudoscience.
I mean, I'm sure those that found out felt crappy, but you can't hold it against yourself for making a decision based on information provided just because you find out 20 years later that the information was bunk.
True, but I don't know. If it were me, I wouldn't be able to get that out of my mind. If I could choose, I would never be on a jury in my lifetime. That responsibility just feels too heavy. Now, if the hair evidence isn't enough to change your mind on the conviction, let's move on to the next piece of scientific evidence that had been brought forward: soil samples. This is another thing that gets me all fired up, but let me give the facts before my opinion. It was stated that authorities had a few separate soil samples tested based on dirt found in the tires of Stephen's truck. During the early days of the investigation, it appears that police had collected soil from his truck tires, but wouldn't go back to the location where Kim's body was found until a year later, at which point they collected soil from there in order to make a comparison. Yeah, a whole freaking year later. Now, at trial, an expert would testify, stating that the 2 samples, the one from Stephen's tires and the other from the crime scene location, had, quote, similar characteristics, end quote.
I don't think you need an expert to testify that dirt looks like dirt.
Don't even get me started. There's clearly holes in this evidence, but let's leave it at that and move on to the final piece of forensic evidence used at trial. It's reported that police had lifted a print off Stephen's bumper. And no, not a fingerprint. Let's call it like it is. It was a freaking butt print. The prosecution claims that the print found, caked into dirt on Stephen's bumper, was similar to a design found on Kim's jeans. To give an example, just imagine like True Religion jeans and how they had like a super intricate butt pocket design. I can only think that it must have been something like that. But based on my research, it's never stated that it's an exact match to the design on her jeans. Only that forensic scientists determined that the patterns were, quote, similar. There's that word again. Similar. Are we seeing a trend yet? None of this scientific evidence at the time is definitive.
Yeah, all of this seems like it should be lumped into circumstantial evidence.
Sure, I'd have no problem if it was used to rule people out, but it obviously shouldn't have been used to try and prove anything. Now, there's one additional piece of evidence that was brought to trial that the Innocence Project did not include in their list of unvalidated forensic sciences, and this was serological evidence. Now, I had no clue what serological evidence was, so I did a little digging to better understand. According to National University's website, quote, forensic serology and DNA analysis are closely aligned sciences, often dealing with the same evidentiary samples which are handled by the same forensic teams. The science behind serology and DNA are therefore typically taught as a single subject. Serology is used to find evidence of an identifiable body fluid, while DNA analysis seeks to accurately match those fluids to a specific individual, end quote. So it appears as though investigators had found fluids on Kim's underwear and body, which were gathered and later sent in for this serologic testing, which determined the fluids were seminal. According to the Innocence Project, quote, a criminalist with the Connecticut State Forensic Lab tested that seminal fluid was detected on the victim's underwear and on swabs taken from her body, and that serology testing was conducted. The the results matched the victim's blood type and were inconclusive regarding Barnes, who is a non-secretor. His blood type is not revealed from bodily fluids such as semen and saliva. DNA testing conducted before trial was also inconclusive." End quote. Yet another inconclusive piece of evidence used to convict Stephen Barnes.
Ooh, that makes me think back to the Gainesville Ripper. So, if I remember correctly, certain people, in this case secretors, have trace identifiers in their bodily fluids which can be used to identify them more easily, whereas this wouldn't be possible with non-secretors.
I'm proud of you for remembering that. Now, to me, it sure seems like there's an awful lot of reasonable doubt when looking at all of this evidence. I know we're looking at it after the fact, but I'm sickened by how unreliable it is. It's all conjecture. It's all circumstantial. It's practically all just speculation. There's nothing definitive about any of it. How can you convict someone based on this and sentence them to the rest of their life in prison when it's clear there is reasonable doubt about who could have committed this crime?
I'm sure it's blasted into the jury's head, the fact that someone needs to be convicted beyond reasonable doubt, but when they get bombarded with all that legal mumbo-jumbo, they can get confused when coming to a decision. And I won't even get into biases and how they may sway a jury, but like you said, none of this evidence really proved anything.
I gotta say, the first thing that I found absolutely obnoxious is the soil sample evidence. Authorities went back to the location where Kim's body was found a freaking year later to collect soil samples. Are you joking?
What's your problem with the dirt?
Oh, come on. I'm no scientist, but really? Think about how much dirt can change over the course of a year. How similar is that dirt to any other dirt that might have been from the area? Is it drastically different dirt that can only be found in the exact spot Kim was found?
Jeez, don't hit me. I just wanted to know what you were thinking.
You want to know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking about how the damn tire tracks found near Kim's body didn't even match the treads on Steve's truck.
Okay, I was already convinced that the soil evidence was unreliable. Now you've got me fully on board that it's BS.
Oh, I'm not even done yet. What about this butt print left on the bumper of Barnes's truck? Are we serious? Do we actually think that this is something you can hang your hat on and be like, yep, absolutely, just because this is here on his truck, and it kind of looks like it might be similar to Kim's jeans? Yeah, that's it. This is our guy.
Yeah, the more you hammer it home, the more doubtful it all seems.
And let's not forget about the multiple eyewitnesses that come forward, placing him in a public place, practically all night the night of Kim's murder. And just to add fuel to that fire, we also find out that any and all fingerprints taken from Stephen's truck were not a match to Kim's. So you're telling me her jeans imprinted on the bumper, but she never touched it with her hands to leave fingerprints behind? Give me a break.
Well, with the eyewitnesses, you had people with totally opposite accounts contradicting Barnes's alibi. But I get what you're saying with the prints. But just to play devil's advocate, the suspect could have wiped down most areas for fingerprints, not realizing that the print from her jeans would be the thing investigators would latch onto.
Okay, sure. Let's say Stephen wiped down the truck. What other physical evidence proves he was responsible for Kim's murder? And I'm saying this from the perspective of wanting justice for Kim and her loved ones. But I also can't not point out the BS that was used to convict this guy. Like, who the hell decided that this forensic science was accurate enough to be used in a murder conviction? With the gene imprint, for instance, how can we be sure that it can, without a doubt, be linked to the pants Kim was wearing? Could the imprint vary based on the pant size? Like, would a size 2, 4, and 6 all leave the same imprint? Were these jeans particularly popular at the time? Could they be unisex jeans and maybe a buddy of his was wearing them when he sat on the bumper? Anyone and their brother could have leaned up against someone's car without them knowing. So, based on that, if some random person sits on my car in a parking lot and then they wind up dead, could I be held accountable for that crime? I mean, honestly, it's just crap evidence and crap science in my opinion.
Well, I will say one thing. I don't think there's any question as to how you feel about this.
Oh, I know. My blood pressure must be through the roof right now. But, moving on. I won't knock the hair evidence too much. I already went over how there's a lot of differing opinions on that type of evidence, but honestly, in 1989, it seemed like hair and fingerprints were like the best types of forensics used back then. Same goes for the serological evidence that concluded the fluids were semen. Yet another inconclusive piece of evidence. While I do understand why it may have caused jurors to lean towards a conviction, the other side of me is stuck on how it doesn't definitively prove anything. The whole point I'm trying to get across is that there are so many pieces of evidence put forth in this conviction that do not prove anything without reasonable doubt. At best, only a couple of the forensic sciences used vaguely point towards Stephen as being the killer. Outside of the eyewitness testimonies and the other evidence we just went over, there was one more rather large contributing factor that most likely had a substantial impact on the jury and their decision to convict Stephen. Robert Stolo, a man serving time for larceny and forgery, came forward claiming that Stephen had confessed to the murder of Kim Simon. The biggest issue with this was that there were very few specifics about where this alleged confession occurred, or even what was said. Nevertheless, Stolo was allowed to testify. We learned that the two, Stolo and Barnes, were only together in the same cell block for a very short span of time, barely a week.
This looks like BS and smells like BS. There's no way I would believe that a guy who maintained his innocence from day one would randomly confess to a crime to some random convict he's bunked with for a week. Bullshit.
Well, wouldn't you know, there's a bit of controversy around this guy's claims. It's not totally clear if he received anything in return for his statements under oath, but some sources state that he was able to reduce his sentence from 6 years down to just 6 months. I mean, come on. If that's true, there's a clear conflict of interest here.
Yeah, I'm always a bit skeptical with these jailhouse informants.
You and me both. Like, they're criminals doing time. Do you really think they'd be above lying on the stand in order to drastically reduce their sentence? I think not. If these people are willing to come forward with testimonies, knowing full well they won't receive anything in return, that's a different story.
Yeah, I agree that they shouldn't receive a reduction to their sentence just for a statement. If their claims prove to be factual, maybe that could add kudos to their probation or parole hearings.
We all know criminals lie, but I kinda understand why DAs and detectives want to use these types of informants, regardless of how unreliable we think they inherently are. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of our trial discussion, Stephen Barnes has always maintained his innocence. He was sentenced in 1989, and just a few short years later, in 1993, his case was taken on by the Innocence Project. I know, they took this on 15 years before he would end up being exonerated. So, I'm sure you're all thinking, what the hell took so long? Well, as we've talked about so many times before, DNA evidence wasn't widely used during this time and was still in its infancy into the early 90s. Even though the Innocence Project took on Stephen's case in 93, it'd still be years until they could make any major moves. It's reported that in 1996, they attempted DNA testing, and it unfortunately came back as inconclusive due to the lack of a full profile. An entire decade would go by before they would make another attempt. By now, it's 2008, and DNA technology had advanced significantly. They're able to have Stephen's DNA tested against the DNA that was found on Kim's body and are finally able to produce conclusive findings. The results come back showing that the DNA found at the crime scene was not a match to Stephen Barnes, and he's released from prison on November 25, 2008, nearly 20 years after he was sent to jail. His official exoneration occurred on January 9, 2009. Stephen would go on to sue the state for his wrongful conviction and won a $3.5 million settlement. I'm sure it doesn't make up for the time he lost, and all over some crappy, inconclusive physical evidence and a jailhouse informant that clearly was not reliable.
Like I said earlier, it's a shame when someone's wrongfully convicted, but it's great to see that with advancements in technology, these injustices can be overturned. Though, when thinking about justice, all I can think is that, sure, it's great that Stephen got off if he really wasn't guilty, but what about Kim and her family?
For all these years, they'd been living under the belief that Kim's killer was caught and had faced judgment. And for the rug to be pulled out from underneath them 20 years later is terrible. Now they're forced into thinking that for those 2 decades, the person responsible for killing their Kim has been roaming free, going about their daily lives without facing the repercussions for their actions. I can only imagine the brokenness that Kim's loved ones must have felt as soon as the news of Stephen's exoneration was brought to their attention. Kim's best friend, Linda Fiorini, who Kim was going to meet the day she went missing, states for the Observer-Dispatch that, quote, "I never expected that this would be reopened and that Barnes didn't do it. And that makes your head spin. You think your killer's doing time for 20 years, and that turns out not to be the case," end quote. As soon as Stephen's conviction was overturned, authorities needed to get back on the case. It had been sitting for nearly 20 years untouched, with everyone under the assumption that they'd found the person who killed Kim Simon. Now, there's a lot going on at this point. New detectives getting assigned to the case, old detectives filling others in on what they knew, reviewing files and evidence they still have, and doing all they can to piece the story back together all these years later. The new detective on the case is Dave Matrulli, who's been assisted by retired detective Jim Helmer ever since the case was reopened after Stephen's exoneration. Since Helmer's initial involvement in Kim's case decades ago, he's been in contact with Linda, Rick, and Kim's family throughout the years. With Helmer's renewed focus alongside Matrulli and other investigators, the question that's on everyone's mind is, if Stephen Barnes is innocent, then who killed Kim Simon? Now, there is at least one other option for who may be responsible. I mentioned earlier on about how people claim to have seen Kim at that supposed satanic party the same night she went missing. There's not a ton of information out there in regards to this, outside of several witnesses who came forward mentioning that they'd seen Kim at the party, but it didn't look like she'd been there because she chose to be, and that it looked like she may have been drugged. We know that people reported hearing screams from the area of the water tower location after 1 a.m., and then the next day, Kim's body was found close by to that location, just a short ways down Mohawk Street. Along with that, we have the statement from a forensic pathologist stating that Kim was most likely killed and then moved to a new location. Now, after ruling out anything to do with Stephen Barnes, police began to theorize what could have happened that night, but there are still gaps in the timeline that it seems only the one responsible may be able to fill in. Based on my sources and everything I could find online that appeared to be reputable, it seems as though the theory investigators are going off of sounds something like this. Kim was walking down Mohawk Street to get to Whitesboro Middle School to meet with Linda so they could walk to Rick's house to surprise him. As she's walking along the road, she's approached by a vehicle. She stops and talks to whoever was driving and either gets in the car willingly or is forced into it. She's taken to these parties, drugged, and subsequently sexually assaulted. The DA, Scott McNamara, even goes as far to state that he believes she was raped and fought back against her assailant, and due to her fighting back, the perpetrators killed her. From there, based on what that forensic pathologist believes, it's speculated that she was killed at the water tower location and then placed further down near that gravel pit on Mohawk Street afterwards. Now, investigators aren't sure, or at least haven't released publicly, who these people are that Kim was supposedly with and that may be responsible for her murder. There have been a few names randomly thrown around here and there, but none of the sources are reputable, and I don't feel comfortable naming names of people who can't defend themselves or that haven't been named officially by police. So, without giving any identifying information out, I'm going to give you a rundown on the next part of this theory. It appears as though Kim may have been seen with at least 5 people the night of her murder, all of whom were supposedly involved in some sort of Satanism or devil worship. It's unclear if they were truly devoted to Satanism or if they were just kind of associated with that lifestyle due to the unfortunately common mischaracterization of individuals who wore black and listened to heavy metal music.
Nerd.
What? You know it's true. People always assumed that those who dressed in that goth style were into devil worshipping, at least back in the 80s.
Oh, I know. I just thought it was funny how you said they were associated due to the unfortunately common mischaracterization.
Yeah. I'm sure most of our listeners know about the Satanic Panic and how crazy it made people act. For those who aren't familiar with it, it was essentially a large-scale belief that there was like this Satanist group performing rituals throughout the United States and killing people because of it. It pretty much lumped all the goth kids into this group. If you were different, wore black clothes, dark makeup, or had some sort of interest in death, people pretty much labeled you as a devil worshiper. The Satanic Panic was fairly prevalent back in the 80s and 90s. However, there are barely any actual cases of murder legitimately tied to Satanism. But as we all know, people will run with theories like this and base their beliefs in rumors rather than fact. It's unclear how serious these people Kim was with that night may have actually been into this satanic stuff, but were still labeled as being involved. Regardless of the affiliation, it seems as though, at least based on several articles online and comments made by the DA, that at least one of these individuals was a woman. After this information was released, rumors began to spread about who these individuals were, and the names started circulating. Outside of the one confirmed female, another woman's name was also frequently associated, but both parties are since deceased. If you're interested in knowing more, it's not too difficult to find. The thing that really had me interested in figuring out more information about these females who were potentially involved in Kim's murder was when I found a passage in an article from the DA, Scott McNamara. He states, quote, "I've interviewed one of them myself, and I wouldn't consider her, the person that I interviewed. I sure wouldn't want her to have witnessed something bad that happened to my family because she doesn't seem like a person that cares about anybody but herself. So that's kind of where we're stuck," end quote.
That's not very descriptive. Does he mean that she wouldn't tell anybody about it because she doesn't want to be bothered?
That's what I was saying. Like, what are you getting at, buddy? But it seems like what you thought he may be alluding to, that he believes this lady to be the type where, even if she knew something or saw something, wouldn't say a peep, because she didn't want to get involved, and the less she said, the less she'd have to deal with. I think it's a pretty disgusting way to live your life where you'd withhold information that could help someone out just because you don't want to be bothered, especially if she knew something regarding Kim's case. But aside from her crappy attitude, the piece of information surrounding her and the other people that may have been with Kim that night had to do with DNA. I assume that once Stephen Barnes was exonerated, police hopped right on the DNA evidence they had and attempted to match it up to someone else. Upon further investigation, it seems as though authorities were able to match up some of the DNA they had. However, it doesn't seem like they've gone on to name the person it had been linked to. According to the Remember Kim Simon website, it states, quote, "Certain evidence found suggests a link to a male individual who attended this party. This individual passed away before the task force investigators could re-interview him regarding results from a DNA sample taken from him," end quote. Based on some articles I read, it seems as though police nowadays are being a bit more careful with the evidence they have. They mentioned that there had been some trouble with their DNA samples and that at least one of them ended up getting destroyed, but they don't go into detail on how this happened. They're now left with just one sample and are holding out on future advancements in technology before they go ahead and attempt to test it.
So while you've been going over some of this, I was looking at the map that's on the Remember Kim Simon website. I know that it's not to scale and it doesn't have the distances perfectly depicted, but I've kind of come to my own conclusion on what I think could have happened, and I didn't know if you wanted me to lay it out for you.
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so those listening may want to look at the map to follow along, or maybe come back to it later when you get a chance. We'll post it on our socials so you don't have to go digging for it. I'm going to make references to the directions based on how they appear on that map.
Okay, I've got it up. Go for it.
So we know Kim left her house and was later seen talking to a guy in a pickup truck on Mohawk Street, roughly 2 miles from her house and about 1 mile from her destination. I'm thinking that this guy offers her a ride the rest of the way and she accepts. When looking at the map, Kim's house is one of the northernmost points, with the Whitesboro Middle School to the south-southwest direction. As this guy is driving her to the school, he continues past her destination. As she becomes concerned, he either convinces her to go with him to Three Bears, or, more likely, drugs Kim or knocks her unconscious. They end up at Three Bears, where Kim is seen either drugged or maybe even concussed, based on how she appeared to eyewitnesses. Around this time, she was sexually assaulted and attempts to escape, running south, losing one of her shoes in the process, which was later found by investigators. South-southwest of that location, another piece of her property was found. From this point, it looks like our suspect may have caught up with Kim and captured her, maybe utilizing their vehicle. Once captured, he begins transporting Kim northeast towards Whitesboro Middle School, passing Harts Hill Elementary along the way. At this time, Kim escapes from the vehicle and runs to the north of the elementary school, towards the water tower, where she's again caught by the suspect, who kills her, and proceeds to move her body further down Mohawk Street to that secluded area near the gravel pit.
That sounds totally reasonable and would make perfect sense as to why her belongings were found in different areas. I can only imagine the police are working with this theory because in the top left-hand corner of the map, it says, possible route of Simon's suspects. I would guess they know the route taken, but I think you've painted a clearer picture of the events that may have taken place along that route. I have a feeling the police do know more than they're telling the public and likely have a more concrete idea of what occurred the night Kim was killed, whether that aligns with John's theory or is something entirely different. Based on the random name drops online, I can only guess that people from the area may have said something about certain individuals, and those comments somehow made their way into online forums like Reddit and web sleuths. I can totally understand why police would be very careful with the information they have, strictly because things have already gone sideways once with Barnes. Police have to be absolutely positive when moving forward with anything else to avoid any more undue harm to Kim's family and loved ones. I truly hope that one day they can all find peace and that the police are able to put this puzzle together once and for all. I know we spent a lot of time talking about the wrongful conviction in this case, even though Kim is the reason we're here talking about everything. The injustice done to her and that which her loved ones have been put through is immeasurable. And the conviction and subsequent exoneration of Stephen Barnes plays into that. In order to fully grasp everything the people involved in this case have been through, it's all got to be covered. But in the end, this is a story about Kim, and she's the most important person in it. Her family deserves real closure, and she deserves to rest in peace, knowing her killer paid for what they've done. Kim was a beautiful soul who loved music. Some of her favorite bands were The Doors and Led Zeppelin. Her boyfriend Rick would go on to help make the decision to play Stairway to Heaven at her funeral, which is just heartbreaking, yet beautiful at the same time. There's a tab on the Remember Kim Simon website where people can leave memories of Kim from when they knew her and talk about the things they remember about her. Rick left a message on the site writing, quote, "Kim was my high school sweetheart. She was intelligent, kind, loving, and beautiful. We planned a future together and enjoyed every moment together. September 18th, 85 changed me forever. So I chose Stairway to Heaven to play at her funeral. I plead someone come forward with info to let my angel and her family get closure. She deserves your time." End quote. I completely agree with Rick's sentiment. Kim seemed like such a lovely person, and the world deserved to know her and love her. She deserves for her story to be told, and her case does deserve your time and attention. The person who killed Kim Simon should spend the rest of their pathetic life in jail. And if they've already died, I hope they were haunted by the memory of it until their last minute on Earth. Linda, Kim's best friend, would go on to write a passage to Kim through her memorial site. She wrote, quote, "Kim was my dearest friend, and losing her so young and tragically has left a permanent void in my life. I will never forget the memories of our time shared together, our endless talks, and the great times we had. I was blessed to have Kim in my life and will continue to search for justice for her and closure for those of us who knew and loved her. Until we meet again, sister, I love you." There's a $5,000 reward available for information leading to an arrest and conviction of Kimberly Simon's killer. If you know anything at all about who killed Kim Simon, please contact the Oneida County DA's office at 315-798-5575 or the current investigator on the case, Dave Matrulli, at 315-527-3577. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.